Three identical little girls walked into a billionaire's office, handed him a red paper crane, and said, "Mom said you'd understand." He did. And his world unraveled. The morning began like any other for Alexander Weston, CEO of Weston Tech, one of the most powerful and fastest-growing tech corporations in North America. His office, perched high above Manhattan on the 50th floor, gleamed with a minimalistic, modern elegance, glass walls, a pristine white desk, subtle lighting, and an uninterrupted view of the New York skyline. The air smelled faintly of imported Colombian roast and polished wood. He liked his world controlled, clean, and precise. People admired his discipline, feared his mind, and respected his distance. To the world, he was a genius in a tailored suit, a man who had mastered time, risk, and opportunity. But behind all of that brilliance was a fortress carefully built to keep his past where it belonged, in silence. That day, he had just dismissed his assistant with a clipped nod and sat down with his second espresso when something odd happened. The double doors to his office opened quietly, not rushed, not dramatic, but with such calm certainty that it unsettled him before he even looked up. Three little girls walked in. They were no older than 6. Blonde hair, soft waves that caught the morning light. Eyes so blue, they felt almost surreal, like they weren't real children but sketches brought to life. They were dressed in pale-colored summer dresses, their shoes clean but slightly scuffed at the toes, as though they had walked a long way or wandered without being carried. They didn't speak at first. They simply stood there, still and confident, as though this tower, this office, this man, none of it intimidated them. They looked around only once, and then all three turned their gaze to him. Alexander stood up sharply. His instinct, as always, was to take control, to demand answers. But something about the way they looked at him stole the words from his throat. A strange tremor fluttered in his chest. The one in the center, perhaps slightly taller than the other two, walked forward slowly. She reached into her pocket and held out a small red object, carefully folded, delicate yet precise. A paper crane. The moment it touched his palm, something cracked inside him. The little girl tilted her head slightly, studying his face as though trying to make sure he had received the message. Then, in a soft, clear voice, she said, "Mom said you'd understand." For a moment, nothing made sense. The room felt too quiet. The world tilted, just slightly. He stared at the crane in his hand. Red. Perfectly creased. The exact shade, the exact design. His mind flew back 7 years without his permission, to another hand that once made these birds for him. One woman. The only one who had ever folded them the same way. Lillian. Her name hit him like a train. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. He hadn't let himself think about her, not really. But now, with this red crane burning in his palm and 3 pairs of identical blue eyes watching him like he was supposed to know something, he did. He knew. Deep in his bones. These weren't just children. These were her children. And if he was honest with himself, he already suspected the rest. His fingers tightened around the paper crane. His voice, unused to uncertainty, came out softer than he intended. "Who are you?" he asked, barely recognizing his own tone. One of the girls, maybe the youngest, answered calmly. "We're Emma, Grace, and Sophie." He swallowed. Something in the way she said it made his heart sink. "And your mother?" he managed to say. "She's in the hospital," said the first girl again. She said, "It's important that you talk to her before it's too late." Alexander Weston, who had once refused to believe in anything he couldn't quantify, fate, love, signs, second chances, felt his carefully built reality begin to unravel. The past had not only returned. It had found a way to stand before him in living form, with small shoes and hopeful eyes. And as he looked at those girls, his asterisk girls, though he hadn't earned the right to think of them that way yet, he felt, for the first time in years, truly afraid. Not of failure. Not of scandal. Afraid that he might be too late. He couldn't remember how he got to the elevator. The crane was still in his hand, slightly crumpled from how tightly he was holding it. His phone lay forgotten on his desk, and his assistant's voice calling after him blurred into the background. The only thing he saw clearly were the girls, walking quietly behind him through the marble lobby, attracting puzzled looks from staff and passers-by. But no one stopped them. Somehow, everyone sensed something significant was happening, like the air itself had changed. Outside, the city moved in its usual frantic rhythm. Taxis honked. Tourists took photos. People stared into screens as if the world existed only inside their devices. But to Alexander, the noise had receded into a dull hum. The chaos of New York didn't reach him now. His mind had collapsed into a tunnel focused on one thing, Lillian Hart. The name echoed inside him, sharper than memory. He hadn't heard it aloud in 7 years, hadn't dared to think of her for more than a few seconds at a time. Not because he didn't care, but because caring had felt dangerous. Back then, he'd convinced himself that he had no choice. He was building something enormous. He didn't have time for late-night talks about dreams or spontaneous picnics in the park. He didn't need paper birds or whispered wishes under the stars. He needed results, success, control. He had told himself she would move on. And if there was pain when she stood in his apartment doorway for the last time, her hands trembling as she handed him one final crane, he buried it so deep inside that it could never rise again. But now the paper bird was in his palm once more, and the pain had risen like a flood. He looked at the girls in the back seat of the car. They sat quietly, watching the city roll by. Not fidgeting. Not talking. Just present. There was something eerie in their calm, something that reminded him of Lillian, the quiet intensity, the stillness beneath the surface. The smallest one, Sophie, held another crane in her lap. A blue one this time. She traced its folded wings with her fingers gently, like it was alive. He turned back toward the window, suddenly afraid of what he might say if he kept looking at them. How could he ask the questions screaming inside his head? Did they know who he was? Did Lillian tell them? Did they hate him for not being there? And what kind of man was he, that he didn't even know he had daughters, 3 of them? The hospital wasn't far. Just a few minutes uptown, in a quiet corner of the Upper West Side, nestled between stone buildings and shaded trees. It wasn't flashy or new. It was the kind of place someone chose carefully, someone who didn't want attention but needed trust. The car pulled up, and Emma, the oldest, or at least the most composed, reached for the door handle without waiting for him. The others followed, moving with that same silent understanding that had unnerved him from the start. Inside, the walls were white and still, the lights soft. A nurse greeted them, her eyes flicking with recognition when she saw the girls. Without asking, she said, "Room 216, and nodded toward the elevator. Alexander followed blindly, his chest tightening with every step. Outside the room, he paused. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to push it yet. He glanced at the girls. Grace looked up at him and gave the smallest of nods, not exactly encouraging, just confirming that this moment was real. He stepped inside. The room was dim. A vase of dying lilies sat on the window ledge. The 4 beeped softly in the background. And there she was. Lillian. Her hair was shorter now, her skin paler, but it was her. The curve of her cheek, the way her fingers rested lightly on the blanket, the tilt of her head even in sleep, it all rushed back to him. It was unbearable, this collision between memory and reality. Her body looked fragile, but her presence was still magnetic. She hadn't lost that quiet gravity that used to stop his mind in its tracks. She opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw him, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It barely touched her lips. But it hit him harder than any accusation could have. I was starting to think the crane wouldn't make it, she whispered, her voice barely above air. He tried to answer, but his throat had locked. He looked down at the red paper crane still in his hand and then back at her. Her eyes followed the movement, and for a second, they sparkled, not with triumph, not even relief, but something deeper. Something almost like forgiveness. I didn't know, he said at last, his voice breaking in the middle. I know, she replied. He pulled the chair closer and sat down. For the first time in years, he didn't care about schedules or headlines or stock prices. He didn't care about how long he had avoided this or why. All that mattered was the woman in front of him and the years between them that neither could take back. I should have been there, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. But you're here now. And in that moment, surrounded by machines and shadows, with 3 little girls sitting just outside the door, Alexander Weston, once the most calculating man in the city, began to feel something he had forgotten how to recognize. He was beginning to remember what love really looked like. The first night was the hardest. He stayed in the hospital room long after the girls had fallen asleep in the family lounge down the hall. Nurses came and went, adjusting Lillian's floor or checking her vitals, whispering softly around him as if they knew something sacred was unfolding. He didn't move. He sat in the chair beside her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped in front of him like he was praying, though he hadn't spoken to any god in decades. The room smelled like antiseptic and lavender soap. The soft beeping of machines was the only rhythm keeping his thoughts from spiraling into panic. Lillian slept, her chest rising and falling with the slow, careful breath of someone whose body was conserving every bit of strength it had left. Occasionally, her lips would twitch, or her brow would furrow, like her dreams were heavier than her frame could carry. He couldn't stop watching her. Every moment felt like a gift he didn't deserve. 7 years gone, and somehow, she looked exactly the same and impossibly different. She was still beautiful, but it was a quieter beauty now, fragile, etched with suffering, yet lit by something that felt like peace. He remembered the last time he saw her, standing in the doorway of his apartment with tears in her eyes and a crane in her hand. He remembered the way she had asked him, just once, to stay, not forever, not even for the night, but just long enough to tell her he still saw her. And he had turned away. He told himself at the time that it was necessary, that his career couldn't afford softness. He was building something too big, too important, and there was no room in it for a woman who folded paper birds and talked about things like fate. What a fool he had been. Now, sitting in that sterile room, the weight of what he had walked away from felt unbearable. And yet, even in that guilt, there was something deeper blooming beneath the pain, an overwhelming sense of responsibility, of clarity. Not just about Lillian, but about the 3 girls who had entered his life so suddenly and completely. His daughters. His daughters. He still couldn't say the words aloud. They felt too big. Too sacred. He had missed their births, their first words, their first steps. He hadn't even known their names until a few hours ago. And yet, when he saw them, he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt something ancient and instinctive rise in him, something that told him they belonged to him and he to them. That somehow, even in his absence, something inside him had been waiting for them all along. Lillian stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and for a moment she looked at him without speaking, as if she were trying to memorize the shape of his face again after so many years. He shifted closer, afraid to break the moment. "You haven't changed much," she said, her voice rough from sleep but laced with a soft, almost amused sadness. "Still stubborn. Still quiet when it matters." He let out a shaky breath. "You should have told me." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I wanted to. So many times. But every time I thought about it, I pictured you just, walking away again. I didn't want the girls to grow up with that kind of silence." "I wouldn't have," he said quickly, then stopped. "No. That's not true. I don't know what I would have done back then. I wasn't ready to hear it. But I should have been." I should have been better. She didn't argue. That was one thing he had always admired about her, she didn't sugarcoat truth. She let it sit between them like a living thing, waiting to be acknowledged. They asked about you, she said after a moment. When they were little, they thought maybe you were an astronaut. Or a spy. Or a prince in hiding. His chest tightened. What did you tell them? That you were someone I once loved very much. Someone who made me cranes and made me cry. Someone I hoped they'd meet one day, when they were ready. When you were ready. He didn't deserve that kind of grace. He didn't deserve her. I don't know how to be a father, he said quietly. You'll learn, she replied. They're good girls. Smart. Kind. They already like you, even if they don't understand why yet. Just be present. They'll do the rest. He leaned back in the chair, rubbing his face with both hands, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with time zones or business deals. Everything inside him felt raw and rearranged. I missed everything, he said finally. Lillian turned her head toward the window. Outside, the lights of the city blinked gently in the darkness. You missed a lot, she said. But not everything. You're here now, and I don't know how much time I have left, Alex. But I know this, if you want to know them, really know them, there's still time. They're not angry. They're just waiting. Kids have a way of opening doors we don't even realize are still unlocked. He didn't trust himself to speak. Instead, he reached into his pocket and carefully smoothed out the red crane the girls had given him earlier. He placed it gently on the windowsill beside the vase of lilies. It stood there, bright against the pale light, a tiny symbol of hope, of a beginning. She watched him do it, and for the first time, her smile reached her eyes. Do you remember the first one I gave you? She asked. He nodded. Before my first pitch meeting. You said it was for luck. And you closed the deal. I didn't believe in luck. No, she said softly. But I did. And I believed in you. He looked at her, and something in him shifted, something that had been frozen for years finally starting to thaw. I want to fix this, he whispered. Then start with them, she said. Start with the girls. Show them that their father is more than the man who left. And just like that, something changed. Not in the room, not in the air, but in him. A crack in the armor. A sliver of light. A quiet, terrifying, exhilarating sense that it wasn't too late after all. The next morning began in a silence that felt different than the silence of the night before. It wasn't heavy with shock or uncertainty, it was thoughtful, almost reverent, like the world around them was holding its breath. Alexander sat on the small couch in Lillian's hospital room, a blanket over his shoulders that one of the nurses had quietly draped there sometime during the night. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but exhaustion had caught him at last, folding his body forward in a restless, guarded sleep filled with flashes of memories he hadn't visited in years. Now, in the pale light of dawn, he was awake again, eyes fixed on a small cardboard box on the table near Lillian's bed. She was still sleeping, her breath steady and slow, but her presence filled the room even in rest. He didn't touch the box at first. It looked old, the edges frayed and corners dented slightly from being carried and set down and picked up again too many times. There was no label on it, no writing. Just a simple, unassuming box taped shut with a strip of soft pink washi tape, delicate and familiar. It was the kind Lillian used to seal notes and scrapbooks when they were together, a detail that made his chest ache. Finally, as the sun crept over the skyline outside the window, painting the floor with gold, he reached out and pulled the box gently toward him. He peeled away the tape as if it were something sacred, careful not to tear it. The cardboard flaps unfolded with a quiet sigh, and inside, he found what could only be described as a small universe. Dozens upon dozens of paper cranes, all folded in varying shades of red, blue, and soft cream, were stacked inside, organized by color and size. Some had aged and softened with time, their creases a little worn, while others looked nearly new. Beneath them, nestled like buried treasure, were small slips of folded paper, notes. Letters. So many, tied together with simple ribbons, dated in careful handwriting that hadn't changed at all. He pulled one out at random. The date on it was almost 6 years ago. Carefully, he untied the ribbon and unfolded the note. It was short, just a few lines. Today Emma laughed so hard she fell over backward and bumped her head. I kissed her 3 times and she stopped crying. You would have laughed, your crooked smile. You were always good with her kind of chaos. He stared at the words for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. Then he opened another. Sophie won't go to sleep unless I hum that song you used to whistle while working on your laptop. I didn't know she'd heard it enough to remember. I don't even know what it's called. She just says it makes her feel like the stars are close. And another. Grace asked me today why she doesn't have a dad like other kids at school. I told her she has one, she just hasn't met him yet. That he's doing important things, but that maybe one day he'll come find us. I don't know if I said it for her, or for me. Each letter felt like a thread weaving a tapestry he had never seen, yet had been a part of all along. He was a ghost in their lives, but not a villain. Lillian had never painted him in bitterness. She had spoken of him gently, even in his absence. There was grief in the words, yes, and longing, but there was also grace, an impossible, humbling grace he hadn't earned and might never fully deserve. He wasn't sure how long he sat there reading, pulling letter after letter from the box, each one a piece of a life he had never lived but now desperately wanted to understand. There were entries about birthday parties with handmade cakes, about illnesses and bad dreams and favorite bedtime stories. There were sketches in the margins, Grace's first drawing of a tree, Emma's lopsided cat, Sophie's attempt at writing her name. He found a photo tucked between 2 of the cranes, blurry, candid, clearly taken from a distance. The 3 girls sitting on a blanket in the park, a picnic basket beside them, Lillian's hand reaching toward them from off-camera. It was a perfect moment of ordinary beauty. When he looked up, Lillian was awake. She was watching him quietly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were wet. I didn't mean for you to find that so soon, she said softly, her voice hoarse but steady. But maybe it's better you did. I had no idea, he said, and it was all he could manage. It felt pathetic, but it was the truth. I didn't know you were writing to me all these years. That you were still, thinking of me. I wasn't writing to you, she replied. I was writing for them. And maybe a little for myself. I didn't know if you'd ever come back. But I wanted them to have a record of how much they were loved. How much you were part of them, even if you weren't here. His hands tightened around the letters. He had read so many things in his life, contracts, business proposals, legal documents, but none of them had ever felt like this. None had ever made his chest feel too full to breathe. I don't know how to make up for all of this, he whispered. You can't, she said, without malice. You can't rewrite the past, Alex. But you can choose what you do with the present. You can show them who you are now. That matters more than you think. I want to, he said. More than anything. She smiled faintly, a flicker of the woman he used to know shining through the lines fatigue had drawn across her face. Then start with a story. Tonight. Tell them one about you. Not the CEO. Not the man who lives in glass towers. The boy who learned how to fold a crane because he was trying to impress a girl. He laughed, quietly, the sound unfamiliar in this setting, but not unwelcome. And for the first time, he saw a future, blurry and distant, but real. A future where he could sit at a table with 3 little girls and fold paper cranes with clumsy fingers and tell stories that had nothing to do with money or markets. That night, when the girls came to visit again, he didn't sit stiffly in the corner like he had before. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the floor with them, a paper square in hand, and said, "Let me show you something your mom taught me a long time ago." And as his fingers folded the paper slowly, awkwardly, the girls leaned in, their eyes wide, and a new chapter of their lives quietly began, one made not of apologies, but of presence. The following days passed in a strange rhythm that Alexander had never experienced before. It was nothing like the precision and intensity of boardrooms or investor meetings, where every second was calculated, every word rehearsed, and outcomes were tracked like stock values. This was something entirely different, messier, slower, quieter, but deeper in a way that unsettled and steadied him all at once. He began spending more time at the hospital, arriving early in the mornings before the nurses had changed shifts and leaving only when the girls' eyelids began to flutter with sleep. His phone rang less and less as the hours went by, and eventually, he stopped looking at it altogether. At some point, without announcing it to anyone, he had told his assistant to cancel his upcoming meetings, postpone his travel plans, and pause his role at Weston Tech, whatever that meant in a world where CEOs were expected to exist in 24-hour cycles. The truth was, he didn't care. He didn't want to be the man whose name appeared in headlines anymore. He wanted to be someone whose name meant something at home. Each day brought small, sacred moments, firsts that shouldn't have felt like firsts, but somehow did. He learned how Emma liked her apple slices with the skin peeled off because it's softer that way, and how Grace insisted on carrying her own bag even though it was too big for her shoulders, because I'm the big sister. Sophie, the quietest of the three, had the strongest opinions when she did speak, and he quickly realized she was the most like Lillian, observant, stubborn in the gentlest way, and frighteningly intuitive. She seemed to watch him not just with her eyes, but with something else, something that weighed his intentions. He wanted to earn her trust, not with gifts or promises, but with time. Time he should have given from the beginning. Lillian was still weak, her body ravaged by the slow, unforgiving illness that had taken so much from her, but she never complained. She rested more during the day, her strength waning, and Alexander took over the space that had always been hers, reading to the girls, packing snacks, asking the nurses questions with growing urgency and knowledge. He stopped dressing like a mogul. His sharp suits gave way to soft sweaters and rolled-up sleeves. He started folding cranes again, every night, one for each of the girls. They kept them in their backpacks or under their pillows, tiny symbols of something neither of them could fully explain but all instinctively understood. One morning, as he sat beside Lillian, he told her something he hadn't said to anyone else. "I've been thinking about leaving the company," he said, not looking at her as he spoke, afraid of what her eyes might reveal. Not just a sabbatical. Really leaving. Giving it up. She was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally turned to face her, she didn't look shocked or worried. She looked calm. Almost relieved. "I wondered when you'd say that," she murmured. "I'm not surprised." "You're not?" "No. Because this version of you, the one I'm looking at right now, isn't built for boardrooms anymore. You've changed. I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's real," she said. "And it's what they need. It's what you need, too." He let the silence sit between them for a while. Outside the window, spring had started to make itself known. The trees on the avenue were budding with tentative green, and the sky was the kind of blue that made everything underneath it feel more possible. "I missed so much," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "But now you have a choice. You can either spend your time regretting the past or spend it building something now." That night, he made his choice. He sat the girls down after dinner, all three of them crowded onto the small pull-out sofa in the hospital's family room, legs tucked under them, their attention bouncing between curiosity and excitement. He didn't use a whiteboard or a slideshow. He didn't explain it like a press conference. He just told them a story, his story. He told them about a boy who was so afraid of failure that he built walls instead of bridges. A boy who chased success until he forgot why he wanted it in the first place. And then he told them how that boy met a girl who folded paper cranes and laughed at his need to be perfect. A girl who taught him how to breathe. And how, when he left her, he thought he had made the smart choice. But years later, 3 little girls walked into his office carrying a red crane and changed everything. They listened, wide-eyed, their heads tilted at the same identical angle that made his chest ache with how much of her lived in them. And when he finished, Sophie climbed into his lap without saying a word and curled into him like she had been doing it her whole life. Later that week, he wrote an official letter of resignation. The board didn't understand. Investors panicked. Headlines speculated. Tech titan walks away from empire. But Alexander didn't read any of them. He was too busy walking Sophie to her preschool classroom for the first time, holding Emma's hand through her fear of losing her first tooth, and helping Grace memorize lines for a school play. He wasn't just trying to be part of their lives now. He was trying to build one with them. And every evening, when he returned to the hospital to sit with Lillian, he folded a new crane, handed it to her, and said, "Today I got it a little more right." And she would smile, tuck it into the growing pile on her nightstand, and whisper, "One at a time." April arrived with a kind of deceptive beauty that made the waiting harder. The sky turned brighter, the air softer, and Central Park slowly turned green again, as though nothing in the world could go wrong beneath such a gentle season. But inside the hospital, beneath the warm sunlight filtering through half-open blinds, Lillian was getting worse. At first, the signs were subtle. She grew tired more easily, her words sometimes trailed off mid-sentence, and her appetite, already fragile, all but disappeared. She smiled for the girls, made jokes for Alexander, but when she thought no one was watching, her shoulders slumped and her breathing slowed as if each movement required calculation and restraint. The light in her eyes dimmed slightly every day. Alexander saw it all. He tried not to show it, but the change in him was immediate. He began reading medical journals late at night, consulting with specialists on other continents, funding private research programs at a rate that made his former financial advisors uneasy. He no longer thought in terms of budgets or forecasts. He thought in hours. In minutes. In moments he hadn't had and ones he might still be able to save. He was in the hallway with one of Lillian's doctors when the news came. The specialist, a calm, pragmatic woman with eyes too weary for her age, explained in the quietest, most respectful voice that Lillian's disease had entered an accelerated stage. Time, she said, was not on their side. The treatment that had been helping her slow its progression had stopped working. They could try stronger medication, but it came with severe side effects. One option remained, a rare stem cell-based therapy undergoing clinical trials abroad, available only to patients with a close genetic match willing to donate. The science was new, experimental, but it had shown signs of promise in a handful of cases. The catch was clear, it would require a donor, and the only likely candidates were immediate blood relatives. When Alexander returned to Lillian's room, he didn't speak of it right away. She was asleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest shallow but steady. Her skin looked nearly translucent against the pillow, and yet, even in this state, she radiated that same quiet strength. The same unspoken grace that had always drawn him in without effort. He sat beside her for a long time, one hand wrapped around hers, the other resting on the paper crane he had brought that day. It was yellow. A color she once told him reminded her of morning hope. The next day, he had the girls tested. He didn't explain the full details to them, how could he? They were only 6, still wrapping their heads around the idea of hospitals and illness and what it meant when their mother slept for most of the day. But he spoke gently, honestly, sitting cross-legged on the rug with them while cartoons played quietly in the background. He said the doctors needed to see if their blood could help their mom feel better. That it would mean a little poke, maybe a small test. Emma asked first, "Will it hurt?" and Alexander said, "A little. But it's for something really important." Grace, always the quiet listener, simply nodded, while Sophie took his hand and said, "If it helps her stay longer, then okay." When the results came back, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in weeks, hope. Grace was a perfect match. A miracle, the doctor said. In cases like these, it was extremely rare to find such compatibility, even among family. But somehow, Grace's markers aligned perfectly with what they needed. What followed was one of the hardest conversations of his life. He and Lillian sat together in her room, sunlight pouring in, and he told her everything. Her first instinct was to say no. She couldn't imagine her daughter undergoing a procedure for her sake. The risk was low, the doctors had explained, but it was still invasive. Still frightening. Still unknown. She gripped Alexander's hand with what strength she had and said, "She's too young. She shouldn't have to be brave for me." But Alexander, gently and with tears in his eyes, said something she hadn't expected. "She's already brave. All three of them are. And this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about giving them more time with you, memories that they'll carry longer than the stories I tell them. I think Grace understands more than either of us expected." They waited a full day before speaking to Grace again. This time, both parents together. They spoke slowly, carefully, not hiding the seriousness but not overburdening her with fear. And Grace, after listening silently, climbed up on the bed beside her mother and said, "If it gives you more good days, then I want to do it." The hospital moved quickly after that. Alexander flew in a specialist team from Europe. They converted one of the unused hospital suites into a makeshift recovery space just for Grace, decorating it with her favorite books and soft pillows and a window that looked out over the river. He stayed with her through every test, every explanation, every blood draw. He learned how to braid her hair the way she liked it and brought her small surprises, colored pencils, a stuffed lion, a pink paper crane he folded on his own. He'd never folded pink before, but she loved it. The procedure happened in the third week of April. The doctors didn't sugarcoat the anxiety, they explained the risks, prepared for complications. But everything went smoothly. Grace was strong. She bounced back quicker than expected, demanding cookies and orange juice before the nurses even finished disconnecting the final tubes. Alexander wept in the hallway afterward, not because something had gone wrong, but because for the first time in what felt like forever, something had gone right. Lillian's recovery was slower. The infusion was just the beginning. Her immune system needed time to adjust, and her body was still weak. But within days, the changes were visible. Her eyes grew clearer. Her appetite returned in small but meaningful ways. She could sit up without assistance. Then she could walk across the room with Alexander's arm beneath hers. The nurses began calling her the miracle patient, and while Alexander hated the word, it sounded too much like luck and not enough like choice, he understood what they meant. One evening, about 10 days after the transplant, the whole family sat together in the hospital garden. The girls were drawing chalk hearts on the stone walkway, and Lillian was wrapped in a blanket on a bench, watching them with a serenity that made the air itself feel warmer. Alexander sat beside her, their hands loosely entwined. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. And when she finally turned to him, her eyes filled with tears but her voice steady, she whispered, "You saved me." He shook his head and kissed the back of her hand. "No. Grace saved you. And you saved me long before that. I'm just finally trying to be the man you believed I could be." She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, they sat without any urgency, without fear, simply existing together. The future was still uncertain. It always would be. But in that moment, surrounded by chalk drawings and warm spring air, they weren't thinking about endings anymore. They were thinking about what could begin. May brought with it a kind of slow magic that Alexander hadn't known he needed. It didn't come in grand gestures or earth-shaking declarations. It came in the quiet, steady rhythm of healing. In Lillian's voice gaining strength one sentence at a time. In the color returning to her cheeks. In the way she walked now, carefully, but without help. The hospital room that had once been a place of waiting and uncertainty transformed into something softer, more like a temporary home, filled with laughter and paper cranes and the smell of apple juice and colored pencils. The girls were there every day after school, curled up on the bed with Lillian, bringing her drawings and stories and questions about things as small as ant colonies and as big as outer space. They talked to her the way only children do, with complete faith that their mother would always be there to answer. By the end of the month, the doctors agreed Lillian could be discharged to finish her recovery at home. It felt surreal to hear those words, home. For a long time, Alexander didn't even know what that meant anymore. He had houses, sure, 3 of them, across different cities, but he hadn't lived in any of them. Not truly. They had been places to sleep, to host meetings, to impress investors. But now he was planning for something different. Something real. He had found a small house just outside the city, tucked away near a lake, quiet and surrounded by trees. It wasn't modern or flashy. It didn't have smart walls or a wine cellar or a private elevator. But it had light. And space. And rooms where the girls could paint the walls whatever colors they wanted. A place with a front porch for rainy days and a backyard big enough to chase fireflies. Lillian had seen the pictures and simply nodded, a tear running down her cheek. It was exactly the kind of place she would have chosen. Moving day was small and beautiful. There were no moving trucks or corporate decorators, just a modest car, a few bags, and the 5 of them holding hands as they stepped across the threshold into a future none of them had expected but all of them now fiercely wanted. The first night, Alexander cooked. It was a disaster, overcooked pasta, a smoke alarm, spilled sauce on the floor, but the girls loved every second of it. They giggled until their stomachs hurt and Lillian, still weak but radiant in her laughter, declared it the best worst dinner she'd ever had. There were no official schedules, no perfectly laid out plans. But slowly, a routine began to form. Morning started with the smell of toast and the sound of feet running down the hall. Alexander learned to pack lunches. He drove them to school, one arm out the window, the other adjusting the rearview mirror to catch their faces. Lillian rested more at first, but as her strength returned, she joined him in small moments, brushing Emma's hair, helping Grace with homework, sitting with Sophie in the garden as she tried to count butterflies. Alexander didn't return to the tech world. Not even in whispers. He didn't host Zoom calls from the kitchen or sneak away to answer emails in the middle of bedtime stories. His old life, so precise, so performative, felt 1,000 years away. Occasionally, someone from Weston Tech would reach out. A board member asking if he wanted to stay on in an advisory role, or a reporter requesting an interview about his sabbatical. He ignored all of it. What he was doing now mattered more than anything he'd ever built with stock or code. One afternoon, he found Lillian in the backyard, sitting barefoot in the grass with a sketchbook in her lap and a cup of tea in her hand. She was drawing the girls. From memory. From motion. From the heart. The lines were loose and soft, alive with movement, and when she looked up at him, he saw that she was drawing again not just with her hands, but with her whole soul. That light was back, the one he had fallen in love with years ago, the one he had walked away from but never forgotten. He sat beside her and didn't say anything for a long time. Just listened to the wind in the trees, the distant laughter of the girls building a fort out of branches, and the heartbeat of a life he never thought he would be allowed to have. Later that evening, Lillian joined him on the porch. She brought out a small jar filled with folded cranes, different sizes, different colors, some crisp and perfect, others rumpled and obviously made by tiny hands. She set the jar on the table between them and said, "I told them every crane is a wish." So they started folding them too. He smiled, picking one up. It was pale blue, folded unevenly, but still beautiful. "What are they wishing for?" "Everything," she said. "Long summers. Nighttime stories. That their dad never stops folding cranes." He looked out at the lake, the reflection of the moon floating quietly across the surface, and something in his chest relaxed for the first time in years. He didn't feel like a man rebuilding his life anymore. He felt like a man living it. That night, after the girls were tucked in and the house had fallen into a peaceful hush, he sat alone in the kitchen with a piece of red paper and folded a crane by memory. He placed it next to the others, but not in the jar. He left it on the windowsill, where the morning sun would touch it first. A silent promise. A reminder. This wasn't luck. This was love, lived on purpose. This was healing, earned one moment at a time. A full year passed, though it didn't feel like 12 months had gone by. It felt like something else entirely, like time had taken on a different texture. It didn't race forward the way it used to in boardrooms and airport lounges. It didn't vanish into emails and meetings and bottom lines. It unfolded. Slowly. Steadily. Purposefully. One morning into the next. One bedtime story into another. The rhythm of life in the Westenhart household had settled into something quiet and sacred. The girls were taller now, their voices stronger and their questions more complex. Grace had developed a love for reading chapter books on her own and was currently obsessed with stories about explorers and maps. Emma had joined a local kids' science club and insisted on mixing strange potions in the kitchen with plastic test tubes. Sophie, ever observant, had started painting beside her mother, watching Lillian's hand with quiet reverence, then imitating her strokes on her own canvas with remarkable skill for her age. Lillian was stronger too. Her health had stabilized far beyond what doctors had predicted. There were still follow-ups, regular tests, and careful monitoring, but she was no longer a patient. She was a mother again. A partner. A woman who could walk through her garden barefoot at sunrise with a coffee in hand and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. Her laughter had become a common sound in the house, and her presence no longer carried the weight of fear. It carried warmth. Presence. Continuity. Alexander had changed most of all. People in town now knew him simply as Alex. Not Mr. Weston. Not the CEO. Just the man who picked up his daughters from school and volunteered to help build birdhouses for the local nature reserve. He no longer wore suits. He no longer talked about acquisitions. He had taken up woodworking, not because he was good at it, but because it allowed him to make things with his hands instead of a keyboard. He made a bookshelf for Grace, a toy chest for Sophie, and a dollhouse for Emma that took him 2 months but became her most treasured possession. He was the man who read out loud at bedtime, who fixed squeaky doors, who sometimes burned breakfast but always served it with a smile. One evening in early June, as twilight softened the sky, Lillian gathered the family in the yard. The air was thick with the scent of blooming lilacs, and the girls had just returned from picking wildflowers along the edge of the lake. They were barefoot and sun-kissed, streaked with dirt and happiness, their arms full of color. Lillian held a large box in her hands, wrapped in fabric instead of paper, and inside it were 100 paper cranes. Each folded by the family over the course of the year, some tiny and fragile, others large and creased with pride. They were every color imaginable, every kind of fold, the careful, the imperfect, the experimental. Each one had a date, a name, or a memory scribbled inside its wing. It wasn't something they had planned. It had just happened. One at a time, one day at a time. "We're going to send them," Lillian said softly, looking around at her family. "Every wish. Every moment. Every lesson we learned." She had prepared a small floating lantern for each crane, light, biodegradable, carefully tied with fishing wire to make sure the cranes would stay safe and upright. Alexander helped light the lanterns, and the girls placed the cranes one by one, whispering things as they did. Some were prayers. Some were secrets. Some were just giggles. Then they carried the lanterns to the edge of the water. The sky was dark enough now to reflect the stars, and the lake was still. They released the cranes together, watching as they drifted out slowly, a trail of soft light and hope moving away from the shore. It wasn't just beautiful. It was profound. It was a letting go, not of the past, but of the pain that once came with it. A celebration of how far they had come. of what they had chosen to build together. After the last crane had floated far enough that its light was only a flicker, Grace turned to Alexander and asked the question he hadn't expected. "Do you ever miss your company?" He looked down at her, this girl who had once saved her mother's life, who had quietly become the heartbeat of their new world, and smiled. "I used to think Weston Tech was the most important thing I would ever build," he said. "But then I met you. And now I know better." Lillian took his hand. Emma leaned against his side. Sophie hugged his arm and closed her eyes, breathing deeply like she was memorizing the moment. They stood like that for a long while, saying nothing, watching the water glow with the last of the lanterns, surrounded by the silence of things finally set right. Inside the house, above the fireplace, there was a new shelf, simple, hand-carved, slightly uneven. On it stood just one object. A single red paper crane, carefully protected in a glass dome. The one that started everything. The one that had walked back into his life held in the tiny hand of a girl he didn't yet know was his daughter. Below the crane, engraved into a small wooden plaque, were 4 words. "She said you'd understand." And now, he did. Completely. This story, at its core, is not about regret, it's about redemption. It's about how time lost can never be reclaimed, but meaning can still be made in the time we have left. What makes the ending powerful is its quietness. There's no grand finale, no cinematic explosion of drama. Instead, there is something much rarer, peace earned slowly, love rebuilt carefully, and healing that doesn't erase the scars but honors them. The red paper crane becomes more than a symbol. It's a message across years, a reminder that some love doesn't disappear, it waits, quietly, patiently, until we are ready to return to it. Alexander's transformation isn't about abandoning success. It's about redefining it. He doesn't lose his identity, he reclaims a truer one. What I love most is that this story doesn't offer a fantasy escape. It offers a possible reality. It dares to suggest that people can change, that second chances don't always come wrapped in perfection, and that the softest victories, like a little girl's forgiveness or a quiet family dinner, are often the most profound. It doesn't ask if we can go back. It asks something braver. What will you do with the time you have now? The last thing Nicholas Rain expected as he sat alone in his hotel lobby was to be approached by 3 identical little girls, blonde, wide-eyed, and holding a silver heart necklace he hadn't seen in 6 years. One look at it, and everything he'd buried came rushing back. He'd given that necklace to the only woman he ever loved. The one who disappeared without a trace. And now, standing before him, were 3 impossible reminders that she may not have left alone. Nicholas Rain didn't believe in fate. His life had been built on structure, precision, and strategy. He planned everything, from his meals to his mergers, weeks in advance. So when his schedule unexpectedly shifted that morning, when his flight to New York was delayed and he was rebooked into a suite at his own hotel in downtown Seattle, he took it as nothing more than a logistical inconvenience. He didn't know yet that this minor disruption would be the beginning of everything he thought he had lost finding its way back to him. The lobby was quiet for a weekday morning, filled mostly with a few early check-ins and hotel staff preparing for a corporate event. Nicholas sat alone in one of the private lounge areas, coffee in hand, phone on the table, but untouched. He stared out the window, thinking about nothing in particular, which for him was rare. Something in the silence settled around him differently today, not heavy, not light, just unfamiliar. He didn't see them approach until they were standing right in front of him. 3 little girls, blonde, around 6 years old, standing side by side like a small army with clasped hands and matching expressions of both nervousness and curiosity. Their hair was tied in identical braids, and their eyes, soft brown, wide, and deeply familiar, fixed on him with a quiet kind of intensity. "Excuse me," the one in the center said, her voice careful but confident, "have you seen a necklace like this?" She held up a small silver heart hanging from a delicate chain, the kind of item any child might have, but this one stopped Nicholas cold. He knew it. Knew it better than anything he owned. It was the necklace he had given to Olivia Hart on her birthday, 6.5 years ago. He had spent weeks choosing it, engraving it with a single letter, O, on the back. It had been simple, understated, and full of meaning. She had worn it every day until the day she vanished. He stared at the necklace, then at the little girl holding it, and felt a strange, slow unraveling begin in his chest. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. "It's our mom's," the second girl replied quickly. "She says it was from someone special, but we never met him." Nicholas's pulse started to race, but he kept his expression steady. "What's your mom's name?" All three girls looked at one another before answering. The third one, who hadn't spoken yet, said the name so softly it almost disappeared in the air between them. Olivia. And that was when everything around him fell away. The background noise, the quiet hum of hotel music, the barista calling out orders, all of it dissolved under the weight of that one name. His chest tightened. Olivia Hart. The woman who had once been his everything. The woman who vanished from his life 6 years ago with no explanation, no warning, no goodbye. He had searched. Called. Sent people. Investigated. She had disappeared completely. Now, here were three little girls, each a mirror of each other, and, more disturbingly, a mirror of him. Blonde hair that must have come from her, but there was something in the shape of their mouths, their brows, the curve of their cheekbones that he couldn't ignore. And those eyes, those wide, searching eyes, were hers in color, but something in the gaze was his. He tried to breathe evenly. "Is your mom here now?" "She's checking in," the first girl said. "We came to sit while she talks to the lady at the desk." He stood slowly, his heart thudding loud in his chest. He didn't know what he was about to face. He didn't know if he was ready. But he knew one thing, he had to see her. Because if this was real, if these girls were who he already feared they were, then everything he thought was behind him had just walked back into his life. Nicholas didn't move right away. His legs were tense, his hands curled slightly at his sides, as if his entire body was trying to hold still while his heart bolted ahead of him. The girls had returned to their seats now, giggling quietly and looking at the necklace like it held a secret they didn't fully understand. He watched them with a strange mix of wonder and dread, unsure which emotion would win out. He felt like he was standing on a cliff edge with no idea how far the fall would be, or what was waiting at the bottom. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her. Olivia. She appeared near the front desk with a suitcase behind her and a worn messenger bag slung over her shoulder. Her hair was longer now, tied in a loose braid, darker than he remembered, but still unmistakably hers. Her posture was cautious but calm. She leaned forward slightly as she spoke to the receptionist, her expression warm and tired all at once. When she turned around and caught sight of the girls across the lobby, she smiled. And then she saw him. For a second, her entire body froze. The color drained from her face, and her hand instinctively clutched the strap of her bag tighter. Her eyes met his, wide and full of something between shock and guilt. She didn't move toward him. She didn't look away either. It was as if time had locked them both in place. Nicholas took a slow breath and crossed the lobby toward her. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the air had thickened around him. He didn't know what he was going to say. He just knew he had to say something. Anything. "Olivia," he said, and even hearing himself speak her name again felt unreal. "You're here." Her voice was almost a whisper. "Nick. I thought you were," he stopped himself. The truth was, he didn't know what he thought. Lost? Gone forever? He had mourned her like someone who had died. But now she was standing in front of him, alive, real, unchanged in ways that mattered and completely different in ways that hurt. She looked at the girls briefly, then back at him. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard. "This isn't how I wanted you to find out." His eyes flicked toward the children and back to her. "They're mine, aren't they? There was no use pretending. She didn't try to lie. She didn't cry. She just nodded slowly. Yes. That one word hit him like a blow to the chest. The world didn't spin or collapse, but something inside him cracked open. It wasn't rage he felt. It wasn't even betrayal. It was grief, for the time he had missed, for the moments he'd never get back, for the birthdays, the first steps, the questions he hadn't been there to answer. Why, he asked, quieter now. Why didn't you tell me? She looked down at the floor before meeting his eyes again. Because I was scared. Because I thought I was doing the right thing. Because back then, I didn't think you would choose us over your career, and I couldn't stand the idea of being someone's complication. You weren't a complication, he said sharply, the words rushing out of him. You were everything. I would've, God, Olivia, I would've done anything if I had known. She closed her eyes briefly, as if the weight of that truth was too much to hold. I know that now. But at the time, I convinced myself otherwise. And once they were born, once I'd built something stable, I didn't know how to go back. He took a step closer, not threatening, just broken. You don't just disappear and take my children with you. You don't get to make that choice alone. I know, she said again, softer this time. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There was silence between them then, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said in just a few words. One of the girls called out, Mom. Who is that? Olivia turned and forced a smile. Just a friend, sweetheart. Nicholas didn't correct her. Not yet. His voice was too raw. His heart was still trying to catch up. But as he looked at those three little girls, three versions of himself in miniature, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Later that evening, Nicholas sat alone in his hotel suite, the city glowing beyond the glass behind him, but he didn't see any of it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of distant traffic, yet his mind was anything but quiet. The conversation with Olivia played on a loop, each word echoing louder than the last. Her voice, calm but hesitant, repeated in his head, every pause pregnant with years of absence and every glance filled with the weight of what she hadn't told him. 3 daughters. 3 little lives he hadn't known existed. How could he have missed so much? He'd spent those years building hotels across countries, speaking on global stages, dining with heads of industries, yet he hadn't known that 3 versions of himself were learning to walk, learning to speak, growing up without him. It made everything he'd achieved feel hollow. Beautiful, polished, but empty. He thought of the way one of the girls had tucked her hair behind her ear in a gesture he knew he did himself. How another had squinted when she focused on something, the same way he always had when reading fine print. These weren't coincidences. They were blood. They were his. He barely slept that night. When the sun finally rose and filtered through the tall windows, Nicholas was still seated in the same chair, still trying to comprehend the fact that his life had just split into 2, the one he'd known until yesterday and the one he was just beginning to understand. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even have the language yet for the emotion that sat so heavy in his chest. But he knew what he needed to do. By midday, he walked down to the front desk and asked for Olivia's room number. The clerk hesitated, citing privacy policies, until Nicholas gave his name. The staff knew him, he owned the place. With an apologetic look, the receptionist handed him the room number. He stood outside her door for longer than he meant to. He thought about knocking. About what he would say if she opened the door and looked at him the same way she had in the lobby, like he was a ghost. But before he could move, the door cracked open. Olivia stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other brushing a piece of hair behind her ear. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were tired, but not surprised. She had known he would come. I thought you might, she said quietly, stepping aside to let him in. The suite was modest, clean, filled with evidence of children. There were coloring books on the table, tiny shoes near the couch, and a stuffed bunny on the bed. It smelled like fruit snacks and vanilla lotion. He turned slowly, trying to absorb it all. Olivia motioned for him to sit. He didn't. "I need to know them," he said. "I know," she replied. "I want that too. I just don't know how we do this, Nick. I've raised them alone. I made the choice for both of us, wrongfully, and I don't know how to bring you into their lives without shaking everything we've built. I don't want to take anything from you," he said. "I don't want to confuse them or disrupt their world. But they're mine. I deserve to know them. And they deserve to know me. We can't pretend this didn't happen." Olivia nodded, biting her bottom lip like she always used to when she was overwhelmed. "They're smart. And intuitive. They'll ask questions. Then we answer them. Together." She looked at him for a long time. She had imagined this moment so many times, reunions filled with blame, rage, maybe even rejection. She never imagined calm. She never imagined him standing there like a man ready to learn rather than a man demanding what was his. "They're in the other room," she said. "You can say hello. But, keep it simple. Let them come to you." He nodded, and she walked to the adjoining room and pushed the door open. Girls' laughter spilled out. And Nicholas Rain, man of numbers, power, and control, walked toward the sound of three little voices that had already changed everything. The moment Nicholas stepped into the adjoining room, the noise settled for just a second, as if the air itself paused to acknowledge the change. The room was colorful and slightly chaotic, with toys, scattered crayons, and half-zipped backpacks lining the floor. Three little girls sat cross-legged on the carpet, each of them looking up at him with open curiosity, the kind that only children possess, unfiltered, sharp, and unafraid. They didn't know who he was, not exactly. But they sensed something. Maybe it was the way Olivia stood silently behind him, watching, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. Or maybe it was in the way Nicholas looked at them, carefully, reverently, as though this was the most important boardroom he'd ever walked into. He crouched down slowly, trying not to loom. "Hi," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I'm Nicholas. I think I might be someone you'll be seeing a lot more of." One of the girls tilted her head. "Are you Mommy's friend?" "I used to be," he said with a small smile. "I'd like to be again." Another girl, more curious than cautious, pointed at him. "You look like me." Nicholas let out a quiet laugh, one that caught him off guard. "I think that's because we're family." All three stared at him, processing that. No fear. No rejection. Just interest. The third girl, the one who had shown him the necklace the day before, crawled a little closer. "You talk like the man on Mommy's computer." That made Olivia smile from where she stood. "That's because he is." Nicholas sat fully on the floor now, legs crossed, jacket wrinkling against the carpet, but he didn't care. He asked their names again, Ava, June, and Lily, and this time remembered who was who. They began showing him drawings, arguing over which picture was better, asking if he knew how to draw horses, if he liked macaroni and cheese, if he had a favorite princess movie. He didn't know how to keep up, but he tried, and every time he stumbled, they giggled and leaned in closer, as if forgiving him made the whole thing more fun. They didn't ask if he was their dad. Not yet. Maybe they didn't understand the concept fully, or maybe they were waiting to see what it would mean if they asked. Nicholas didn't push. He didn't need to name it. He just needed to be present. At one point, Lily pulled a photo album from the shelf and plopped it onto his lap. It was heavy and full of snapshots, birthdays, first steps, beach days, art projects, spilled cereal, scraped knees. He flipped through each page like it was sacred, silently mourning everything he hadn't been there for. But he didn't let grief win. Instead, he looked at each photo with awe. He studied their baby faces, their silly expressions, the way Olivia had captured it all with care and love. And he realized she hadn't just protected them. She had poured everything into giving them a joyful life. Eventually, the girls got restless and returned to their toys, dragging him into a game that made no sense but required him to wear a tiara. Olivia watched from the doorway with arms folded, a quiet storm of emotions behind her eyes. Nicholas looked up at her, still wearing the plastic crown, and smiled. "You did an incredible job," he said. "They're amazing." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "They are. And I don't want to take any of it from you." "I know," she said. "But I don't know what comes next." Nicholas nodded. Neither did he. But he knew what came now. He stood, walked over to her, and spoke quietly so the girls couldn't hear. "Let me be part of it. Not because I'm owed anything, but because I want to earn it. For them. For you. However long it takes." For the first time since he'd found her again, Olivia didn't look away. She nodded. And that was the beginning of everything new. In the days that followed, Nicholas made no grand promises, offered no ultimatums, and didn't try to insert himself where he wasn't welcome. Instead, he showed up. Quietly. Every morning, he brought coffee for Olivia and a small treat for the girls, nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful. Sometimes it was a new set of colored pencils, sometimes stickers, once a book about dinosaurs that Lily had mentioned in passing. He didn't stay long at first. He knew Olivia needed time to adjust, to understand that this version of him wasn't here to reclaim the past or disrupt what she had built. He was simply trying to belong in the present. The girls welcomed him without hesitation. Within a week, they began waiting for him by the window. When they saw him approaching, they'd race to the door, their voices echoing through the hallway. "Nicholas is here." Ava would call out, while June demanded he sit beside her for breakfast, and Lily insisted he learn the latest dance she had made up in the living room. He found himself folding laundry with Olivia while the girls played. He took them to the park, holding all three of their tiny hands in his much larger ones as they crossed the street. He read to them, learned their bedtime routines, helped clean up toys, and asked questions about things he didn't understand, things Olivia had once had to handle entirely on her own. At first, Olivia watched everything from a distance. She was polite, even warm, but hesitant. She still hadn't forgotten the night she found out she was pregnant or the fear that followed. She hadn't forgotten what it felt like to imagine telling him and seeing her entire future vanish in his expression. But this version of Nicholas was different. He was softer, not in weakness, but in patience. He listened more than he spoke. He offered help but didn't press. He let her lead. And slowly, her guard began to shift. One rainy afternoon, while the girls were napping, they sat in the small living room with the sound of light thunder outside. Olivia curled up on the end of the couch, a book in her lap, while Nicholas sat in the armchair with a cup of tea he hadn't touched. "I keep waiting for you to disappear," she said suddenly, not looking up. He didn't pretend to misunderstand. "I'm not going to." She closed the book but didn't look at him yet. "It's not that I don't believe you. It's that I don't know how to stop expecting it." "I don't blame you," he said. "But I'm still here." Silence filled the room again, heavy but not cold. When she finally looked at him, her eyes were glassy, not with tears but with the weight of what she had carried alone for so long. "Do you regret not knowing them?" she asked. "More than anything in my life," he answered without hesitation. "But that doesn't mean I'm going to spend the rest of my time with them apologizing. I want to build something with them, Olivia. I want them to know that I'm not just a visitor." "They already think of you as more than that," she said softly. "But I'm still trying to figure out what to think of you." He nodded. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The thunder outside rumbled a little louder, but inside, the quiet between them shifted. It was no longer distance. It was beginning to feel like trust. That night, when the girls ran to him in their pajamas and pulled him into a goodnight group hug, Olivia stood in the doorway and watched. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her eyes told the story. Nicholas looked up and met her gaze, and in that single glance, everything between them became something new. It wasn't love again. Not yet. But it was hope. And that was more than enough. A month passed, and with it came a sense of rhythm none of them had expected. Nicholas no longer felt like a visitor. He wasn't just the man who showed up with warm muffins or bedtime stories, he had become something constant. The girls began to talk about him like he had always been there, asking if he would be at the school play, if he could come to the doctor's appointment, if he would teach them how to swim in the summer. They didn't ask for permission to love him, they simply did. And Nicholas, who had once walked through life with the confidence of a man who had everything, now found himself humbled by 3 small hearts that had opened for him without demand or condition. Olivia watched him closely during this time, not with suspicion anymore, but with careful wonder. He was nothing like the man she had walked away from. That man had been driven, brilliant, and charming, yes, but also distant, always 10 steps ahead of the moment they were in. This Nicholas knelt to tie shoelaces, stood in line for preschool pickup, and got glitter stuck to his cuffs from helping with craft projects. He carried June to bed when she fell asleep in the car and kept extra juice boxes in his briefcase, just in case someone gets thirsty. He was becoming a father not just by title, but by presence. And it terrified her how much she wanted to let him back in, not just for them, but for herself. One evening, after a long day of errands and birthday party planning, Olivia found herself alone with him in the kitchen while the girls colored at the table behind them. She was stirring pasta, and he stood beside her, drying dishes without needing to be asked. The simplicity of it, this domestic stillness, felt more intimate than anything that had ever passed between them before. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to imagine what this would be like if you had known. If we had raised them together from the start." Nicholas didn't look up. He dried a glass and set it gently on the counter. "I've imagined that every day since I met them. I don't let myself go there often," she said quietly. "Because it hurts too much. It feels like a whole life I stole from all of us." He turned to face her. "You didn't steal anything. You did what you thought was best with what you knew. I hated it, yes. I resented it. But I also see them now, how happy they are, how safe, and I know they weren't missing love. They had yours. I just wish they'd had mine too." She stared at him, eyes filling slowly but not spilling. "You're saying all the right things, Nick. It's hard not to let myself believe it." "I'm not here to say the right things," he said. "I'm here to stay. And if staying means proving myself every single day, I will. Not to erase the past, but to build something better from it." There was a silence between them, thick with emotion, and then Lily called out from behind, holding up a drawing. "Mom! I drew Daddy." Both of them turned at once. Olivia blinked, startled, while Nicholas froze. None of the girls had called him that before, not directly. Lily didn't seem to realize the weight of what she'd said. She was smiling proudly, showing off a scribbled picture of him with a crown and stick-figure arms holding hands with 3 smaller girls. He swallowed hard. Olivia looked at him, then at Lily, then back again. And she smiled. A small, hesitant, but real smile. It wasn't permission, not yet. It wasn't a surrender. But it was an acknowledgement that something had shifted again, that the space between fear and forgiveness was finally narrowing. That night, as he said goodnight to the girls and Olivia stood in the doorway watching him pull the blanket over Ava's shoulders, she whispered softly so only he could hear. "You're doing it, Nick. You're becoming their father." He didn't respond with words. He just nodded, deeply moved, and looked at her like she had just handed him the world. Because in a way, she had. Spring came with longer days and gentler mornings, and everything in their lives began to bloom with it. Nicholas had started carving time out of his tightly structured corporate calendar to be with the girls more often, not because he had to, but because it finally felt like the only time that mattered. He wasn't just appearing at big moments anymore. He was there for the tiny, forgettable things, the cereal spilled before school, the lost socks, the giggles at bath time, and the quiet cuddles when someone was feeling small. Olivia no longer questioned whether his commitment was temporary. She saw it in the way the girls looked at him, the way they reached for his hand automatically, the way they called him Dad without hesitation now. And she saw it most clearly in the way Nicholas looked at them, like they were the center of a world he hadn't realized was missing. One Saturday afternoon, the five of them went to a local spring fair. The girls wore matching denim jackets, bouncing between booths with painted faces and cotton candy fingers. Nicholas bought too many raffle tickets and lost at every single game but pretended it didn't matter. He let them talk him into riding the carousel 3 times in a row, even though he hated the dizzying spins, just to hear them laugh. Olivia followed behind, camera in hand, documenting what felt like their first true day as a whole unit. Strangers passed them by and smiled like they were just another young family enjoying the weekend. Nobody saw the history. Nobody saw the lost years or the pain it had taken to get here. And for the first time, neither did she. That evening, after the girls had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from sugar and sun, Nicholas and Olivia stood together on the small balcony of the hotel suite. The sky had turned a soft shade of navy, and the city lights blinked like distant stars. Olivia leaned against the railing, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, the night breeze brushing across her face. Nicholas stood beside her, arms crossed over his chest, his presence no longer careful or calculated but quietly rooted. "They had the best day," she said softly. "So did I," he replied. "I can't remember the last time I felt like this." "Like what?" "Like I wasn't running from something." She turned to look at him. "Were you running from me back then?" "I was running from anything I couldn't control. And you were never something I could predict. You loved big, you dreamed loud, and you didn't fit inside my world, Olivia. But now I see the truth, I didn't know how to live in yours. You were brave enough to raise 3 lives on your own. You didn't wait for someone to rescue you. You became everything they needed. And I want to be someone who deserves to stand next to that." Her eyes glistened with quiet emotion, but she said nothing for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a familiar silver necklace, the heart he had given her all those years ago. She held it in her palm, the moonlight reflecting off its surface. "I kept it," she whispered. "Even when I wanted to forget. Even when I told myself it didn't matter." Nicholas reached out gently and closed her fingers around it. "It still matters. And so do you." The silence between them shifted again, this time into something fragile and deep. Not longing, not apology, but the early echo of forgiveness. "I don't know what this means," she said, barely louder than the wind. "It doesn't have to mean anything yet," he replied. "It just has to be real." They stood there for a long time, not as ex-lovers or parents negotiating shared responsibility, but as 2 people who had been broken in separate ways and were now quietly beginning to repair something between them. And when Olivia leaned her head gently against his shoulder, Nicholas didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stayed there, still and sure, and let the weight of her trust rest on him like something sacred. Summer arrived gently, with golden light that lingered late into the evening and a warmth that settled over everything like a long-awaited exhale. The girls finished their school term with paper crowns and ice cream sticky hands, and Olivia began planning a quiet getaway to the coast, a chance for them all to breathe without the noise of the city, without the weight of past shadows pressing so closely. What she didn't expect was Nicholas offering to come along, not as a guest, not as a provider, but as a part of them. When she paused before answering, unsure of what it would mean, he simply said, "I just want to be where they are." She believed him. The small house they rented was a few minutes from the ocean, tucked behind dunes and waving grasses, with a weathered porch and a garden filled with hummingbirds. It wasn't luxury, and it wasn't polished, but it was perfect in the kind of way that comes only with simplicity. The girls ran barefoot across wooden floors, laughed in the surf, and fell asleep to the sound of waves through the open windows. Nicholas, who once thrived on sleek towers and tight schedules, spent his mornings making pancakes shaped like sea creatures and his evenings reading 3 stories in a row because no one could agree on just one. He had sand in his shoes, freckles across his nose, and a calm in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. Olivia watched him, always quietly. She watched how he carried Lily when she got tired, how he let Ava correct his shell identification skills without interrupting, how he gave June space when she got shy, always returning with gentle presence instead of pressure. He never tried to replace the years he had missed. He simply filled the ones unfolding in front of them. And it was in those moments, watching the way her daughters trusted him, the way he spoke to them with kindness and not control, that Olivia began to feel the final pieces of the wall inside her begin to fall away. On their last night by the coast, they lit a small fire pit in the yard. The girls roasted marshmallows while Nicholas helped them turn the sticks slowly to keep them from burning. Olivia sat on the steps of the porch, barefoot, wearing a sweater that once belonged to him but somehow never made it back after one too many chilly nights. The moon was high, and the stars spilled like stories across the sky. When the girls finally drifted off, curled together on the couch with half-finished esmores still in their hands, Nicholas came to sit beside her. He didn't say anything at first. Just sat there, the silence between them no longer something to fix but something they shared. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a delicate silver chain, a match to the one she had carried all those years, the second half of a set, with a heart shaped to fit perfectly with hers. He opened his palm and offered it to her. "I had this made when I bought yours," he said. "But I never gave it to you. I thought I'd wait for the right time." She looked at it, then at him, her voice soft but steady. "And now? Now I'm not waiting anymore," he said. "Not for them. Not for you. I know we can't go back. I don't want to. But I want to move forward, with you, if you'll let me. Not as a perfect version of who we were, but as the people we are now. Flawed. Wiser. Ready." Olivia held the pendant in her hand for a long time. It was warm from being in his pocket, and yet it felt like it had waited for her, too. She thought of all the nights she had held on to the original, wondering if she was foolish to keep it. And now, as the sea wind moved softly through the trees and the firelight flickered across Nicholas's face, she finally let herself believe in something she had buried a long time ago. She reached for his hand. "I'm ready," she said. He didn't say anything right away. He just closed his fingers around hers and exhaled the kind of breath you only take when something heavy has finally been put down. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet and ordinary and real. The next morning, the girls woke up to find their parents drinking coffee on the porch, sitting close, laughing at something only they understood. And in that small moment, with the ocean humming nearby and a day full of sandcastles ahead, they felt what had been missing for so long. Not just love. But home. What I love most about the ending of this story is how quiet and grounded it is. It doesn't rely on a grand declaration or a dramatic twist, but instead leans into something far more powerful, emotional honesty and earned connection. Nicholas doesn't win his family back with money or charm. He rebuilds trust the only way that matters, through consistent presence, through patience, and by choosing to show up even when it's hard. That transformation, from a man who once feared vulnerability to someone willing to live inside it, is what gives the ending its weight. Olivia's journey is just as meaningful. Her forgiveness isn't rushed, and her trust isn't easily given, which makes it all the more beautiful when she finally reaches out, not because she needs to be saved, but because she's ready to let herself be loved again. And the girls, in their innocence and openness, become the bridge that reconnects two people who thought too much had been lost. This isn't a fairy tale where everything is suddenly perfect. It's something better, a story about people who break, learn, and heal in real time. And by the final chapter, what they've built together doesn't feel like a second chance at an old life. It feels like the first chance at a new, real one. And that, to me, is the most satisfying kind of ending.